Plain Truth. I'm your host, Plain, and each week we like to get into some of the mysteries of the world around us. And this week we have a guy who's very appropriate for that, Adam Gorightly, a fellow who's been on the fringes of the, what can we call it, the conspiracies of the world, the edges of the weird, the crackpots, and all that kind of thing. Adam, are you there?
I am here. Thanks for having me on,
Plain.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. And joining us for the ride are a couple of my friends, Daddy Bob and Gigi. Are you there, Daddy Bob?
Yes, I am here. Glad to meet you, Adam.
Likewise, Daddy.
And Gigi.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
Great, Gigi.
Look forward to the evening with you.
Likewise.
Okay, well, let's just get into the heart of this. So, Adam, you have written a series of books and articles over the years that really get into oddball, crackpot, strange kinds of things. And it's just fascinating. How did you get into this?
Oh, shucks. Had some seminal experiences when I was in my late teens, early 20s that kind of set me on this course. One was a psychedelic UFO encounter, of all things, and that got me really questioning consensus reality, such as it is. And also early on, I was in junior college, so I was probably in my early 20s, so that was the early 80s. And I was walking along campus one day and saw a sign on a post that said, "Did the CIA kill JFK?" which kind of blew my mind at the time. I'd never entertained such notions before, so these events and other things, got me interested in paranormal, UFOs, conspiracies, and psychedelics as well. So these are the type of topics I've written about over the years.
Well, that UFO experience sounds a little strange. How would that compare with most? Did it look like a normal craft? Like a
I don't know
military or?
Oh, no, not at all. This was, I've talked about this quite a bit in the past, but I'll recount it for you here. This was in the late 70s, so I was in my late teens, and myself and a colleague, good friend of mine, I'm still good friends with, we were on LSD, as was, the fashion back in the day. And, did my share of experimentation back then. And so we were at a party, and it got a bit intense, so we decided we wanted to get the heck out of there. And let me preface this a bit by saying, that was those days, there was kind of a yearning, myself and my friend, and a lot of the guys I ran with, gals back then, to experienced the movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and that was in the air. So there was this yearning in us to leave the planet or see extraterrestrials. And so that seed was kind of there. And so we were tripping that night, and this was in suburbia, and we were walking along. We got on, figured we'd hike along the ditch bank that was kind of away from people. And before we even set foot on the ditch bank, I said, what if we saw some UFOs tonight? Nobody'd believe us, and we both started laughing at that point, somewhat uncontrollably. And shortly after, it wasn't but 5 minutes, we saw our first UFOs. And if what we saw were hallucinations, we both saw the same things because we were describing these objects to each other. And the first few we saw were your classical, quote-unquote, normal UFO things that have been reported down, through, the last 50, 60 years. One was a cigar shape, more was a, saucer-shaped craft. But as the trip progressed, these things, whatever they were, started getting stranger, weirder. I remember one in particular was like a multicolored cartoonish thing with a spinning propeller on it. And so, these things almost became cartoonish, and there's like an interaction between us. And once again, we were, both of us were, as we were seeing these things, do you see what I see? Yeah, my God, this is mind blowing. During the course of that experience, we saw about 8 different craft. And I remember the last one we saw was like a meteor that came down from the sky, and it stopped in mid descent, then turned into a UFO of some sort, and disappeared. That was the last one we saw. Then we turned around and headed back the way we came, and this was a trek that was maybe a mile and a half or so. When we got back around the area where we saw the UFO, that's when we saw a beam of light come down from the sky, emanating from nothing we could see that was projecting it. And that kind of ended the experience. It was so intense at one point. I remember the first craft we saw made me fall to one knee. We were so blown away by this. And so anyway, that was in a nutshell, that was the experience. In the years that followed, I wrestled with what exactly we had seen that night. Initially I was convinced, I saw ETs, but then as I got more researching the phenomena, I entertained other notions such as maybe this was some type of military mind control experiments. Or I remember one time I was reading a book about that compared or suggested from a Christian viewpoint that UFOs were some type of demons, and I've kind of got into that mindset for a while. But the theory that made the most sense to me was when I read some of John Keel's work. It was probably in Operation Trojan Horse or one of those books, where he talked about something called the super spectrum, and that and he mentioned people on psychedelic trips are often able to see into the super spectrum, or people with inclination towards psychic abilities or these type of things, that they could tune in to a certain wavelength and maybe find a UFO window, and in that different brain space, the same type of brain space you can get in through by entering trance states, not only through drugs, but however, if you could enter that space, you could open one of the, a doorway, or see something that is always there, but that we're not in the, right state of mind to see. And so I think that's kind of what basically what we did when we had our experience. And I also want to note that, prior to the experience, we joked, what if we saw a UFO? And I think we, in essence, planted a seed, somewhat like a magic ritual. And, there's been, down through the ages, people using magical rituals to sort of initiation rites, where you use, in some cases, psychedelics, ayahuasca, and these type of things have been used to communicate with the others. So anyway, that was one of the experiences that set me on the path, and that, in essence, was my psychedelic UFO encounter from 1978.
Well, it's quite a story. I don't actually think you're unique. It's just not too many people talk about these things.
Right. And well, there's a lot of folks who have had similar experiences, and I've kind of looked pretty deeply into that and cataloged similar experiences in some of my writings. One of my pieces that appeared in a anthology called Dark Lore was titled "Were the Early UFO Contactees Ritual Magicians?" where I looked at some of these ideas. Then in kind of later years, you've had folks like Bill Hicks, for instance, the famed comedian. He had with a friend of his, had a seminal UFO encounter while on psilocybin. Then you have folks like Graham Hancock, the author of Fingerprints of the God. In a recent book called Supernatural, he talks about, taking ayahuasca in the Amazons and experiencing entities not unlike the same little guys that Whitley Strieber has encountered. And oddly enough, in like the early 70s, there was a whole host of people using psychedelics and some messing around with Crowleyan magic and these type of things that all had similar experiences. Robert Anton Wilson and Terence McKenna and Timothy Leary and Dr. John Lilly. So yeah, these aren't uncommon experiences, but they've been, in I guess more popular ufology, they try to kind of sweep
Well,
these
they don't like
experiences.
them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You know that. I went to a UFO conference once because something else was in the same hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a speaker from Brazil who published a Brazilian UFO magazine, and it was really a great magazine, by the way. Um, and So I listened to him give a speech, and it was great as far as it went. But you know what it was? It really was like a young guy. He wasn't a young man at the time, but it was like a young kid, like maybe we might have been at age 12, with Star Trek. You know,
Mm-hmm.
Captain Kirk. It's like, I want to be on the Enterprise. You know what I mean? It was
Yeah.
very much like there are these civilizations that are 200 years more advanced than we are, and they're flying around out there, and they've got, lasers and stuff that would be really cool if we had, right?
Yeah.
In other words, a very nuts and bolts approach to the issue.
Exactly. That's the framework, popular ufology, the people who are prominent in the field and the ones you'll see at conferences and whatnot, they basically fit into that box that wants to attribute the phenomena primarily to extraterrestrials. And I'm not saying that we haven't been visited by extraterrestrials, but I think it's hard to, from my experience, to classify it. Well, because what I experienced, I felt, and I lean towards more a theory that a guy named Matt Toney's wrote about in his book called The Crypto-Terrestrials, that it's a phenomena that's been with us here on Earth, forever. And it's talked about in all down through times, whether they're described as fairies and elves during from Celtic lore, or in later times, with the dawning of the space age and all that, they became first, in the 50s with the early UFO contactees. They're described as coming from Venus and Mars, and they were blonde Nordics. As time evolved, they became Zeta Reticuli and these little gray guys. But I think that's just we need to, as humans, we feel it necessary to classify things and put them within some sort of parameters. But
Well, then you got to add the fact that it's very convenient for the military types to kind of, throw paint on the wall and make it all messy and promote certain things, right?
Well, and there's a certain amount of disinformation. There's certainly, with that's another area I've looked into quite a bit with Area 51, and when those sightings started in the late 80s, this is over a military base, and people are seeing all these strange things, and there was part of the thread line that was put out there, the story was that they were ETs, which is a
Convenient.
convenient way of muddying the waters for what was most likely going on out there was, this testing advanced craft we were, the military was working on. And same thing goes, with a lot of these stories, the legend about Dulce Base and all this. If you trace them back to how the stories really got started, the Office of Air Force Intelligence were involved with promulgating a lot of this mythology of the ETs. Once again, not to say that ETs haven't visited us, but I think it's a broad stroke of the brush to attribute all of UFO strange encounters to ETs.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you can tell it's been so convenient for the powers that be, because that and you see this in your work, and that is most people who have, I guess you would say, decent jobs care so much about their respectability and their reputation, right? And so it's a total turnoff. You have to run away from the topic. Once Area 51 became alien as opposed to being like high tech, all of a sudden no professor will even mention the words Area 51 in public, right? Because now you're threatening his respectability, and same with doctors and engineers and whatever. It just, and so that's very, very convenient. Imagine you had the ability to just make people not look into stuff you were doing.
Well, yeah, it's a way to discredit folks. Back in the late 70s, Paul Benowitz, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his story in relation to Kirtland Air Force Base and the whole Dulce story. It's chronicled in a book called Project Beta by a friend of mine named Greg Bishop. But basically, Benowitz was a government contractor for Kirtland Air Force Base. That's in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he'd been observing some strange things going over the base and got quite alarmed, and was also picking up different electromagnetic signals and strange lights over a weapons storage area that were out of the normal. And he alerted the base and brought this information. They had a big meeting with Air Force personnel, and so they told him, Mr. Benowitz, we're going to enlist you to help us. And then they started feeding him, and this is pretty well documented, feeding him disinformation that the ETs were involved with this. Eventually, Benowitz kind of went off his rocker and really ended up a pretty ruined man that had a mental breakdown. But whether the Air Force was trying to drive him crazy like that, I don't know, but they certainly did discredit him and launched the myth, that it was ETs that were responsible for some of these strange lights seen at Kirtland, as well as the strange doings that were going on in the Dulce area.
Hey, Adam, Gigi here. I have any number of questions for you.
Sure.
So, when I saw Eyes Wide Shut, I really felt that was Bohemian Grove just all over the place, and oh my God. And I was interested that Kubrick died, didn't he, before it was finished? And I'm wondering if you can connect that to Scorsese's Wolf of Wall Street today. Is there a thread here? And do you see mind control coming primarily through film and television, or is it also moved to a vibrational mind control coming out?
Scorsese and the Wolf of Wall Street. I haven't seen that. What's the connection you're making there?
Well, I'm wondering if there is a connection, because Wolf of Wall Street's getting a lot of press, both negative and pro and con, of outrageous, really, drugs, alcohol, sex on Wall Street, with this one fellow who was mildly jailed and now out. And Eyes Wide Shut was for sure full of symbolism. And if you haven't seen Wolf of Wall Street, then I guess you can't make the comparison.
No, I can't. Have you read an article I wrote?
I did.
Okay, yeah.
The Conformist?
It was in The Conformist, yeah.
Yeah, I did read it.
Okay. I forgot what it was titled. Probably just something, but yeah, well, just to kind of a brief description of that, when I saw Eyes Wide Shut, it's been several years ago now, a decade, I was looking into mind control research and had read all the lore about the of course MK Ultra, but then the Monarch mind control programs where they use different Wizard of Oz imageries and whatnot, and I saw a lot of that in Eyes Wide Shut, and it jumped out at me. It seemed like it was intentionally inserted into the movie. As I've looked over the years, more into Kubrick's work, it seems like all of his movies have these type of things in them. What was the second part of your question?
Mind control today. Do you see it coming in? How do you see it coming in today besides film and television? Is it coming in vibrationally at all?
Well, that's certainly possible. I had I wrote a book on the Manson family, and this was in the late 90s when I started looking into all this mind control stuff. The MK Ultra, originally began with they were using, this was in the early 50s, using different drugs and hypnotism to try to create Manchurian candidate types or easily controlled victims, and doing those type of experiments on our own troops to see how easily they could be conditioned or manipulated by perhaps enemy forces. But in later years, in the late 90s and really the late 80s, you started hearing all these stories about more high-tech microwaves and vibrational stuff. And when I was writing my Manson book, looking into this stuff, I did have a couple of experiences two at home and two at the same restaurant, where I felt like somebody was perhaps beaming microwaves at me. I can't say for sure that's what happened, but
sort of felt like it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a very odd experience. And I can't say for sure. I meet a lot of people. I was at a conspiracy convention not long ago, and there's whole groups of people that they call themselves TI now, targeted individuals, and you've probably read a lot of their stories as well. It's kind of hard to find a smoking gun in a lot of these stories, but these people definitely seem to be affected by something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's
Well, in the case of Manson, what are your thoughts now? Do you think he was handled?
He has certainly hinted as much, and that's what initially got me writing that book back in the day. There was all these conspiracy stories revolving around the Manson family, not only military mind control experiments, MK Ultra, that they'd been used in LSD type of experiments, but also that there was a lot of heavy involvement with the music industry and the movie industry, and so there's all these theories around Manson. So that's what initially got me writing that book way back when. And so was he handled? It certainly seems that way. One of the first people to look into the story was the famed conspiracy researcher Mae Russell, whose name you might know.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, back in around 70 or so, she started interviewing this guy named Preston Guillory was his name. He worked for the LA's sheriff's office at that time, and or during the time of the Manson family. And they were observing Manson, and he was out at Spawn Ranch, and this guy was a parolee, and he was doing all this stuff, had underage women, and they had weapons and all this stuff out there. But there was basically the policy, even all this, while this stuff was going on, that he was told to keep hands off from Manson. And so the theory is that Manson was some type of agent provocateur, and that he was used, like a lot of people during that period, to infiltrate the movement, the anti-war movement. You had, you know, this was called COINTELPRO, which the FBI and CIA was involved with, where they were inserting people and, you know, to infiltrate the hippie movements, the Black Panthers, the yippies and whatnot. So that was one of the theories around Manson, that he was some type of agent provocateur trying to stir up unrest during that period. Then there's other theories. You know, Manson and his family were there in the Haight-Ashbury during the same time that the CIA was doing a lot of their MK Ultra experiments. In fact, there's a book by a lady named Green in Germany that entertained this theory and said that Manson was basically a test tube creation. Other people, you know, like Maury Terry and the Ultimate Evil linked Manson up with the Process Church of the Final Judgment and the Son of Sam murders, and that all these things were connected. And so there's a lot of, and that's what I did in the book, was to connect a lot of these dots. And even Manson himself said at one point, he kind of used the phrase that, quote, he wanted to know who was peeing on his leash, end quote, which meant they basically, you know, when you wet leather, it expands. So they kind of let him out a little bit. Then when they had used him to their purposes, they pulled him back in. So in essence, if all of this is true, he was used as a scapegoat, you know, to basically paint a negative image. And that's what, getting back to Mae Brussels, that's what she said was behind all of this, was to basically undermine the 60s counterculture with the Tate LaBianca murders and all and whatnot. So I get pretty in depth in the book on all of this stuff, and as time passes, it gets more difficult to talk about it because there's so many little details that.
Well, you know, Adam, I think one thing we can say though is over time, more stuff comes out that makes us more suspicious about how infiltrated or totally operated many of these counterculture groups were, or musical, you know, bands or different things. You know, the fanzines, the whole freaks, you know, Vito. And you know, some of the people looking into stuff nowadays, like Dave McGowan or Jan Irvin or whatever. And you know, you can interpret different facts different ways, but nonetheless, it certainly looks much more like, how can we put it? These things, you know, at the time, I mean, it may have seemed spontaneous, but if nothing else, there were feds all over these things.
Well, yeah, and Dave McGowan, he points out that how all of these rock stars who ended up in Laurel Canyons had all these connections in their families to military intelligence and whatnot. And the Manson family, a lot of the people in the Manson family too, had those same type of connections. So yeah, boy, McGowan certainly brings up some strange coincidences, and he's not sure what to make of all of it as well. He basically puts it out there and says, well, you can make up your own minds. Jan Irvin, he kind of makes some leaps I wouldn't necessarily make. Recently, the one about Terrence McKenna that got a lot of play. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah. I'm aware that he's essentially admitting he was an asset or whatever.
Well, all he said in the, I don't know, one way or another, I tend to doubt that, but what he said, and it's taken from like a 2-hour lecture or something he did, where he says, and yes, I was an agent for them what he meant by them, I think, were the mushroom spores, not necessarily intelligence agency. But uh, according to Irvin, though, there was some deal made with the FBI back in the day. I haven't looked into all those details like a lot of people involved in the 60s counterculture that were involved in the drug trade and whatnot. Perhaps he had to cut a deal like
Well, see,
Leary and
that's
a lot of other
actually
people.
that's another thing is maybe somebody, whoever, it could be Leary, it could be McKenna, maybe somebody was working for the feds, and you can more or less prove it, but they might have been leaned on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like maybe they were busted for possession, and that's what Dave McGowan's getting into. You have all these young guys who had two things over their heads. They had large-scale drugs going on all around them, and they had the draft, and yet they managed to avoid both of these problems.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that raises a lot of questions, but it also could be that some people got busted and they agreed to kind of become informants or whatever. We just really can't know.
And
But I'm just going to say, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and a lot died too.
Yeah, that's true too. But anyway, I mean, after the fact, looking back on it, we can say, geez, it certainly looks like it was a lot more infiltrated and controlled than it felt like at the time.
Well,
But then again, maybe
all
we
the
were having
acid,
too much fun.
all the acid came from the CIA. There's no doubt about that. The stuff that Kesey got his hands on, early on, that certainly influenced the merry pranksters, and that's where Timothy. I'm sure that's where Leary got his. So the CIA was responsible for a lot of good times, and perhaps that did undermine the anti-war efforts at the time, where people got more, with the LSD experience, more into finding themselves and perhaps.
Well, I think it also turned off the middle America that, the anti-war movement started to look like hippies instead of looking like, union workers' kids, their sons.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
Yeah.
going from this, I think this is kind of a good segue into some of the stuff you're working on now, because this is the counterculture, and out of that came a lot of interesting things from the '60s, and one of them, of course, is this whole Discordian phenomenon. Kerry Thornley, you wrote a book about him, and then he was one of the founders of this Discordian religion, if you want to call it a religion, philosophy. And I can hardly do justice to it. I hope our listeners are a little bit familiar with it. The kind of a joking philosophy in praise of Eris, the goddess of chaos, the famous story of her throwing the ball at the party dedicated to Calliste, the most beautiful woman of them all. And of course, that gets all the goddesses fighting amongst themselves, and that's how you start a civil war. So that's quite a goddess to worship, right, Adam? So why don't you give us a little bit on your book on Kerry, and move it into the Principia Discordia and this Discordian history archives you're working on?
Yeah, of course, Thornley was involved in all this stuff we've been talking about, conspiracies and perhaps MK Ultra and whatnot. He and his friend Greg Hill, when they were in high school, that's when they originally started, or discovered or experienced the goddess Eris, and came up with this quote-unquote spoof religion, Discordia. That started when they were in high school, but Thornley went on after high school. He was in the Marines. He knew Lee Harvey Oswald in the Marines. Started writing a book about Oswald 3 years before the Kennedy assassination, which is an oddity. And then afterwards, he was, like 65, he wrote, after the assassination, he wrote one of the first books post-JFK assassination called Oswald. It basically took the Warren Commission's position that he was a psychologically unbalanced lone nut assassin. Then Thornley's view changed a couple of years later. He started to suspect there was a conspiracy behind it as he learned more about the Kennedy assassination. And then in 67, the Summer of Love, Thornley was into all kinds of psychedelics, and he was in a mate-swapping kind of cult, and and also involved in Discordianism and all these strange activities. During that period, he got indicted by Jim Garrison. Of course, we know from Oliver Stone's JFK movie was based on Garrison's investigation. Garrison indicted Thornley, claiming he was one of the notorious Oswald doubles and that he was somehow involved in the JFK assassination. Thornley denied that at the time, and ultimately Garrison's case kind of died out when he wasn't able to prosecute Clay Shaw, and the charges against Thornley got dropped. A few years after that, in the early 70s, Kerry began to suspect that he'd been manipulated and that he'd been part of the conspiracy and that he'd been an MK Ultra type patsy. So that's Thornley's story in a nutshell. Of course, there's all the involvement with Discordianism, and I wrote about that in my first book, The Prankster and the Conspiracy, which was back in 2003 that came out. So it's been 10 years. So I started interacting with, when I was writing that book, with some of the principals that had known Thornley and were involved in Discordianism, like Robert Anton Wilson, among a few others, interviewed Wilson, and also a fellow named Robert Newport, who was buddies with Thornley, and the co-founder of Discordianism, Greg Hill, back in the late 50s. And Greg Hill had kept archives over the years, and he died in 2000, and those were passed on to Robert Newport, who shared some of those with me, and I used some of the material for The Prankster and the Conspiracy. Then a few years back, he was planning to do something with it, maybe set up an archives, but he got busy landscape painting, and so passed on these archives to me, which is a huge collection, which has led to a number of other book projects, including a website, historiadiscordia.com, that folks can go to, that is kind of helping release a lot of this material, and also will be like a vehicle to promote the different book projects coming out. The book projects will be, one is called Historia Discordia, The Origins of the Discordian Society, and that should be out this year, as well as another book that gets more in depth on Thornley and the Garrison investigation. Among the Discordian archives, there was also a lot of Thornley's original JFK-related materials, and so I talked a bit about the Garrison investigation, The Prankster, and the Conspiracy, but that's going to be greatly expanded on in this new book called Caught in the Crossfire, Kerry Thornley, Oswald, and the Garrison JFK Investigation. That's going to be published by Farrell House, and that'll be out sometime this coming year, I believe. Then there's a couple other book projects. One of the things I found within the archives was a unpublished Robert Anton Wilson manuscript, and there's a big story behind that, but I got together with the publisher, and he contacted Wilson's daughter, who's the executor of the estate, so we're working on getting that published as well. And there's some other cool stuff. There's a fourth book too, which is the original paste-up documents of the Principia Discordia, that they used, to make the most popular edition, the fourth edition. And so that's going to be a unique project too that shows how Greg Hill constructed and put together what it's become a pretty famous, book and publishing underground counterculture over the years. So that's a lot of the stuff I'm involved with.
Yeah, that's a full load you got there.
Yeah.
Where can we begin? Well, I heard you talk in an interview about some of the doubts you had about the way Garrison handled Thornley, and
Yeah.
I know that that's kind of been a debate topic in the JFK research world.
Yeah.
I've seen they've had debates on this, and of course, like a lot of things, it kind of breaks down into two camps.
Yelling at each other.
Yeah, there's a bit more, what can we say, heat than light, I guess,
Right.
in that particular question. And so it's a long story, but suffice it to say, Thornley was on the edges of a lot of things that makes it seem to most of us really, really unlikely that it just happened by pure chance. I mean, we usually think of one or two coincidences, but he probably had about 20 or something when it comes to the JFK situation. And it does make you wonder if maybe he wasn't, while not necessarily being a participant, maybe he wasn't being set up from behind the scenes and encouraged to go different ways that would be useful for them. He might have been an alternative patsy, if they needed him.
Well, that was one of his theories, that he was a fallback. He could be a fallback patsy in the JFK assassination. Mike, I kind of lay it out there, and like I do in a lot of my books, and let people come to their own conclusion. I suspect that he was manipulated, and he suspected that. Let's go back to when he was in New Orleans in 1961. He had moved to New Orleans, him and his pal Greg Hill. Thornley was a budding writer, so they wanted to get out of Southern California, go experience the world. So they went to New Orleans and lived there for a couple of years. And there was an overlap time, and that's when Lee Harvey Oswald was for a couple of weeks also in New Orleans, which was a curiosity. And it was claimed by one witness that she saw Oswald and Thornley together. And I get into this quite a bit in the book and consider her a pretty sketchy witness, but let's leave it at that for now. But that's what Garrison picked up on, and that's one of the reasons he went after Thornley. When Thornley was in New Orleans, he was a very outgoing, extroverted character. Met all kinds of people and was writing these different books and trying to gather information about colorful people in New Orleans. And he met a couple of characters by the name of Gary Kirsten and Slim Brooks. Kirsten, who he called brother-in-law, because Slim Brooks said, "That's my brother-in-law." So these two characters, brother-in-law and Slim, and these guys claim to have connections with the underworld, and maybe they were involved in intelligence work, and they'd have a bunch of philosophical discussions, and one of them was how to kill a president, and in particular Kennedy. Thornley at the time, he just considered this a kind of morbid intellectual exercise. Later, he suspects that these conversations such as this were perhaps taped and were going to later be used against him. So as the years passed, he just knew these guys in the early 60s and kind of forgot about them until the early 70s when he saw the photos of the three notorious tramps in Dealey Plaza. Those guys, don't
Sure.
you?
Okay.
Yeah, and he recognized one of them. He suspected one of them was E. Howard Hunt, and that E. Howard Hunt had actually been brother-in-law. If you look at E. Howard Hunt's background, of course, he was notorious spook involved in Bay of Pigs and Watergate. That's when his cover really got blown during Watergate. And that was the period these photos emerged of the three tramps and the comparison of Hunt and Thornley. Thought, wow, that was the guy who was screwing around with me in New Orleans. And that's when Thornley started suspecting that he'd been some type of patsy and that MK Ultra was perhaps involved. When you look at the history of Hunt, too, Hunt shows up at Atsugi Air Base, where both Thornley and Oswald were stationed at different times. And Atsugi, it turns out, was where a lot of the MK Ultra experiments was going on with the troops back then. And during that period, this was the late 50s, the biggest storehouses of LSD were in two places. They were at Atsugi Base, and they were also in Manila. That's the two bases where Thornley was stationed when he was overseas. So, you start looking at all these connections. It looks, wow, something was going on here. And, Thornley's theory that he might have been manipulated during this period seemed to make a lot of sense. There's also stories to suggest that Oswald was also used in the same type of LSD testing program.
Wow. There's just so many of these, you just can't find it to be all coincidental. Hey, Daddy Bob, you got a question?
Yeah, go ahead. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I want to go back to something that, way back at the start of the interview when you said something about UFOs always having been here. You kind of hit a hot button for me there. Are you familiar with the megalithic yard theory that originated with Alexander Thom back in the 50s?
Oh, no, share it with me.
Okay, well, let's bring it up forward a little bit, and it was written up and studied by Christopher Knight and Alan Butler out of the UK. They wrote a book or two on it, and what they had discovered, well, what Alexander Thom originally discovered and they expounded upon, was that they were able to find a measurement system that is used all over the Earth, and it's not simply in buildings, but it's in the planet and in the moon and in the solar system. Now, where I'm going with this is that Alan Butler broke off himself and wrote a book in 2012 called Intervention. And it's a concise little book, but he makes the point that he believes that practically all of our history is a manipulation by our own selves from the future. And I thought about that when you said they've always been here. Do you have any comment about anything like this?
Yeah, that being a manipulation from ourselves in the future, man, that's a mind bender. I think what I meant they've always been with us is that it seems this is more like just a gut feeling of the experience I had and people have had down the ages, that what I saw were some type of energy critters, if you want to call them that. And I think down through time, people have put a template over these things. I kind of talked about that before, how in the 50s they were seen as more of the classic Nordic blondes and whatnot. And so I think, and later times, whatever, reptilians, people are seen, but I think this energy, whatever it is, I think it might be part of ourselves, reflections of ourselves, been interacting with us in sort of a symbiotic fashion for a long time now. A lot of people get the impression it's sort of a vampiric energy that's feeding off us. I'm kind of rambling here, but that's just kind of my gut feeling about it.
When you said something about, I don't know, about being ourselves, I was reminded of, do you know what Adam Cadman refers to?
That's something out of Masonic lore or
the Kabbalah.
The Kabbalah. Refresh my memory.
Well, it's the idea that we are all part of the original man, and the original man, and we are all descended from the original man, but that original man is the mind of God. If I've got anything straight.
Yeah. Well, that was, we get into psychedelics here, and just from a personal viewpoint, that's what I got out of the experience. Whether I was being manipulated by other forces, I don't know, but that's, I think, the sense of, and what perhaps is positive about the whole psychedelic experience is that you feel one with the universe, and we all are one with whatever that source is.
Okay.
So, Adam, do you see us working our way out of this place because we're in such a yin-yang experience? Do you see a renaissance coming? Do you buy into that at all?
That would be nice.
Yeah, it would be. But
I don't know. I've heard people talk about the Renaissance coming for a long time, it seems like a long time it's been in my life, which is really just a wink of an eye. But you hear that we're, some people suggest we're on the verge of some breakthrough. People are becoming more enlightened. I don't know if I necessarily see that or not. That would be nice to think that is going to happen, but maybe we're putting too much significance on our own role as humans in the great scheme of things.
Yes, I think it's hard to know, but it seems as a result of the internet that these moves that you're speaking to in all your writings are becoming more and more obvious.
Yeah, that's a good point there. The internet, for good or ill, has really created this onslaught of information. Sometimes I feel like it's an overload, and we're just being washed away in so much information that it takes a lot of time figuring out, separating the wheat from the chaff. And there's so much disinformation as well, that I think people get wrapped around the axles with some things like, a lot of this FEMA camp stuff that
right. Yeah.
stories like that where they think it's
Adam?
Yeah.
Adam, I think that, though, getting into the FEMA camp, you get into another agenda. There's a fear agenda.
Yeah.
Right. Pretty obviously, right? I mean, it sells. People get excited. It sells on TV. It sells on the internet radio shows, right?
Yeah, and there's yin and yang with it. It's like people have become, it seems, more health conscious. I've tried to, and so there's a lot of good information out there on the web, but and with alternative media, with all the podcasting, these types of things going on. But then once again, it can be used to manipulate people. You need to get your survival kits, whatever they're selling. I'm not saying you shouldn't be prepared and all that, but there's the fear mongering aspect. And I don't want to necessarily pick on all of Patriot Radio and whatnot, but that's kind of been there with a lot of that over the years. And that's where a lot of the FEMA stories started, that they were whoever was ordering 50,000 guillotines, and this type of these type of stories that play on people's fears,
Well, for sure. I think they, how can we put it? I mean, look, it's their job to prepare for the end of the world, right? And if they haven't been doing it properly up to now, and now they get more money and they do it, well, that doesn't prove that it's the end of the world. It just proves that that's kind of what their mission statement is.
Yeah.
Now, there are a lot of reasons to be worried on all kinds of fronts, right? But nonetheless, there are certain stories that are kind of like memes that are out there, like Chinese troops or FEMA camps or whatever. And in the end, I think the FEMA camps would be more where places that people would fight to get into because they'd get free blankets and soup. You know what I mean? In other words, they're not coming to your door to put you in FEMA camps. They're the alternative. When things get nasty, people will be running to get there kind of idea.
Yeah.
And they may or may not have terrible vaccines or God knows what. But you know what I mean? I'm not trying to say it's a good thing. I'm just trying to say that, in a sense, it's not what we should be focused on. That's just kind of my take on it. But for sure, the internet has allowed, some of these things that maybe are not totally the right focus, but nonetheless, on the whole, it's a great chance for us to test the 100th monkey theory. Well, we've certainly got 99 monkeys. Yeah,
and I could attribute the internet, to whatever success I've had, probably to quite a large degree. I started writing about this stuff was in the early 90s, and then the zines were where a lot of the information was being shared, and so that was kind of a network that predated the internet, and there was a very pretty small audience of people sharing, these self-produced magazines. Some have continued on over the years, like I wrote for Paranoia magazine back in the day, and they've continued into the internet age. But with the dawning of the internet, kind of killed that scene, and it transmorgified into the internet. And so, that's allowed perhaps, the stuff I do to reach a larger audience. And I did some podcasting back in the day, and back in the day, I say 2007, 2008, 2009. So, that definitely helped, just publicize my books and what I was doing more. So, yeah, it's certainly been a great vehicle. There's a lot of, once again, a lot of garbage out there, but that's up to the the audience.
Yeah, but relative to what, Adam? Relative to TV?
Well, that's
what is that Sturgeon's law in science fiction? 90% of everything is crap.
True. Yeah.
So we just have to live with that. But back for a second to your new project. So you've got this website for it, and then within it you've got a lot of like normal posts, right? Your stuff you're working on these days. And are other people helping you with this?
Yes, there's an army of dedicated Discordian quote-unquote experts. Actually, it's myself and there's a couple other people involved with the website. One guy goes by the name of Groucho Gandhi, and he's actually a publisher with Fiji Press, and he's going to be publishing some of these projects. And also there's a young guy we're going to get involved. His name is Brenton Clutterbuck, and yes, that's a real name. He's an Australian lad who I met a year ago or so, and he's working on a book project called Chasing Eris, and this turned into a worldwide book project. He traveled through the U.S. and then Europe and South America, interviewing different people practicing Discordianism, so he'll have some input on the site. And it seems like things are coming together with people working in these areas. There's, once again, my project with bringing all these archives out. There's Clutterbuck, what he's doing, as well as Daisy Eris Campbell, who is the daughter of Kenneth Campbell, who is the a play director, stage play director, who staged the Illuminatus as a play back in the late 70s. First in London, and they brought it over here to the States, and it was basically, taking Wilson and Shea's Illuminatus and bringing it to stage, and it was quite the spectacular. It went for 23 hours long, and it went through the whole Illuminatus trilogy, quite an undertaking, and I know Daisy Campbell is now putting together a stage production of Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger, another Discordian effort. So it seems like a lot of this is starting to come together at this point in history for whatever reason. So yeah, I'm excited about all these projects.
Well, it sounds like we're standing on the verge of chaos.
Hail Eris. All hail Discordia.
It's about time we got some more chaos in this world. Yeah, I recommend listeners go to that website, Historia Discordia, and see some of the posts there. They're quite interesting.
Oh yeah. We're trying to get a lot of content on there, so it's there's just tons of stuff. I don't see the posts slowing down any time here in the near future, so it's going to be a pretty active website with a lot of different and new material going on there.
Well, I always thought of it as kind of really Discordianism kind of coming to its own out of Lumpanics. Is that what really kind of...
That's part of the story.
Michael Boy and all that?
Mm-hmm. Well, he was a part of it. I would say there was different things that launched Discordianism more into popular culture. One was Illuminatus by Wilson and Shea. Mm-hmm. And if you're familiar with that work, it's basically this science fiction, Discordian, conspiracy, extravaganza, mind-blowing book. And the first book was dedicated to Kerry Thornley and Greg Hill, so they were a large influence on Illuminatus, and that's when in the Illuminatus they talk about the Principia Discordia and different things that deal with Discordianism. So that was kind of the first big mention, and people were wondering, what the hell is Principia Discordia? Where do we get that, though? They couldn't find it, It was this, because it had been published over the years, very, in like short runs, of a few hundred copies. So it was like this underground thing that people heard about, but nobody really saw. Then I think it was really Lumpanics, that published it, got it more the first time it was published and went out, to a vaster audience. Then Stephen Jackson Games came out, not only with the Illuminatus card game, but another version of the Principia Discordia. So all of these things kind of helped push it more into popular culture. And nowadays, if you do a web search for Discordianism, you'll see that it has a huge presence on the internet and really a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it was kind of, I don't know if you want to call it was a joke, but it was kind of, what's the word? A flippant thing back in the 70s.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was kind of like a topic for discussion, just kind of for conversational purposes as much as anything. If you like to BS about philosophy or whatever, I mean, here's, you know what I mean? It was kind of something to sit around having a beer or whatever, coffee, and then joke about.
Sure, yeah, and it means a lot of different things to different people, and they got involved with different things with Discordianism. There was Operation Mindfuck that kind of got a lot of the Bavarian Illuminati popular again in a lot of ways. And so a lot of people point at Kerry Thornley and Robert Anton Wilson had as much to do with promoting the resurgence of the Illuminati as anybody else really has. And I'll get into that a bit in my book, a lot of the roots to a lot of that stuff. But yeah, Discordians were, I mean, they're seen in a lot of different ways. Thornley and Hill and those guys were kind of seen as artists, hippies. It was, partly an art movement. They were discussing philosophy. They were counterculture. And as it's progressed over time, Discordianism can really be whatever you want it to be. That's the beauty of the religion. And you can name yourself your own pope and start your own Discordian cabal and excommunicate other popes if you don't like them. And as the old saying goes, quoting Greg Hill, Malaclips the Younger, the quote goes, "We Discordians must stick apart."
I like that. I like that. There's something else that I think is kind of interesting is that they did this when they were in Whittier, right? Whittier High School.
That's where it all started.
So many things have come out of that area.
Tom Waits and Richard Nixon and who knows what all else.
Yeah, well, Nixon is the one that comes to mind. But having spent a little time in that area, it just amuses me. But in a way, it was like the coming together of modern America, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
The settling of Los Angeles after the war and all that. So it was kind of like a combination of all the energies of America put in one place in Southern California. And I guess that's how you get some of the music and other things. You know what I mean? It's kind of like you got a mix of a certain amount of, Chicago or Southern blues, or you got you know what I mean? You got different kinds of influences coming together and made it quite interesting. But anyway, let's see. I think we can just about wrap it up now. Are there any last topics or points that you might want to get into, Adam? Your websites, you have gorightly.wordpress.com.
Very good. Yeah, that's more of a wacky, fun website where I post amusing stuff like kooky Christian album covers and bongo broads of the month and that type of stuff. So that's there. Then there's the historiadiscordia.com. Then there's an adamgorightly.com. So there's those three websites, and I'm on Facebook if anybody wants to friend me, and also Twitter. Gorightly at Twitter, I guess it is.
Okay. And a couple of your books that the titles so people can search for them.
Happy Trails to High Weirdness, a Conspiracy Theorist Tour Guide. That's the most recent. I'm most well known for The Shadow over Santa Susana, Black Magic, Mind Control, and the Manson Family Mythos. And just go to either my website or look on Amazon.com. All the books are listed there.
Okay. And then I got one last thing, just this because of my personal interest. So lately, you're, I guess that article in Paranoia, and then from your site, I've been looking into this Tuesday Weld question. Was she a high Illuminati priestess, and was she involved in creating the culture that we know and love today, coming out of Hollywood and music and so on? And I must say that there's a tremendous amount of interesting information about her out there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it not remotely, proof of anything. Right, but and then didn't you recently somebody put together like a 77-page article or something?
There's a guy named Charlie Teague who read the original story. There was a couple stories I did. One was basically about my adventure going to Santa Cruz and meeting with this guy Jeffrey Turner, who has all these theories about Tuesday. Well, that was the original piece, and I did one with Douglas Hawes, who's a friend with Jeff Turner, for Paranoia magazine, called what the heck we call that? Tuesday Wells Psychedelic Illuminati Conspiracy or something like that. And then I started hearing from other people, and there's different people that suggesting, that Tuesday Weld was involved in a cult, or that she was a mind control victims, and other people who were connecting stories that so it kind of opens something up in people's imagination, or maybe a reality. There's something there at the core of all this. And one of these fellows was this Charlie Teague, who did a examination of the Tuesday Weld movie, Lord Love a Duck, and sees all these mind control and Illuminati connections in it. And so he came up with whatever it was, a 77-page piece. I haven't read it all. I think he's working on a condensed version for Paranoia magazine.
Mm. Well, anyway, those were interesting articles, and there's a lot more to it than you might think. She was clearly an interesting character. There's no question about that. To what extent she actually was a high priestess, well, that remains to be seen. But
I don't know. It's a fun story, that's for sure. And I tried to present it from this perspective. I don't necessarily believe or disbelieve. I was just reporting on what other people were telling me, and connecting some dots.
Okay, well, Adam, thanks so much for your time. We'll call it a wrap for today. We do appreciate it. And thanks, Daddy Bob and Gigi, and thanks, everyone, for listening.
You're
Take
welcome.
care.
Have a
Bye.
good night.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks. See ya.